Welcome to ThePrint. Over a decade ago, an intoxicating tide of moral purpose washed over the country. Under the leadership of social activist Anna Hazare, thousands of people took to the streets, carrying out protests and demonstrations with just one demand. They all wanted a watchdog, an ombudsman in the nature of a Lokpal, to watch over corruption in the echelons of power. There was enough pressure. In fact, India came to a standstill for a few months at the time, and there was enough pressure built up for the Manmohan Singh-led UPA government to bring in the Lokpal and Lokayuktas Act 2013, and this is the law that we'll be talking about. This is the authority that we'll be talking about in today's episode of Laws of the Land. For this episode, you have me, Apoorva Mandhani. We have with us Bhadra Sinha, and we have with us Supreme Court lawyer Pranav Sachdeva. Thank you so much for joining us, Pranav.
Thank you, Pranav. So to start with, Pranav, was it the Anna Hazare movement which led, to the coming in of this law? Would it be right to give credit to that movement, or was something building up before this movement began?
There was some history because in 1963, the concept of a constitutional or a statutory ombudsman and the name Lokpal was given by a late Dr. L.M. Singhvi, who said there should be some statutory ombudsman to inquire into corruption complaints.
Right.
And several bills were introduced, but they all lapsed. There was a demand, and the demand was going on for about 40 years. But after the several corruption cases came into light in the period of 2009 to 2011, and the media also exposed a lot of corruption. The judiciary was also taking up corruption cases, and so there was a feeling that all was not well.
Right.
And there is a need to fight corruption. In that backdrop, when Anna movement came, it got a lot of traction from the public, and the corruption became a central issue. Anna movement also had because there was a solution being proposed. So that also appealed to the people that here are people who have come up with a draft law of an independent, completely independent body of Lokpal, which will be independent of the politicians, of the government. So that is why ultimately the bill was introduced and it was passed in 2013.
Mm-hmm. So basically, it would be right to say that it was the people's movement that led to the formation of this new law.
Yes. So it is the people's movement which led to the formation of the law, and ultimately it is the loss of the interest of the people that has led to a situation today where the act and the Lokpal has not really worked.
Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later to understand how effective the law has been.
Yes.
So before we move on to the nuances of what the law is all about, you spoke about, certain bills being introduced in the past, particularly by Dr. L.M. Singhvi, late Dr. L.M. Singhvi. So could you just tell us why they were not really accepted? Was it that the parliament was not willing to have this kind of a law? Was there any debate that happened on these bills, or these bills simply lapsed?
Yeah, so they were introduced in Lok Sabhas earlier, and with the lapse of the dissolution of the Lok Sabha, every time it used to get lapsed. So in between, there were some states which had their own Lokpals or Lokayuktas, several states like Odisha, Karnataka, etc. But at the center, there was a complete reluctance.
Okay.
And it was very, very clear that even in this time, if Anna movement was not there, there was no intention to pass and create an independent body. Right. Because no government at the center or no politician, they don't want any independent agency to be investigating them. They wanted the agencies which are under their control and the people who are under their control to be and the mechanism of sanctions, prior permissions, etc. to scuttle all kinds of investigations.
All that
they wanted complete control, so there was complete reluctance to pass this law. Even after Anna movement, it took a lot of effort, and the law went through a lot of dilution.
Okay, over the period of years.
The Act also has a lot of deficiencies.
One question before we go on to the Act. Yes. See, we have a specialized agency called the Central Bureau of Investigation, which looks into corruption cases. Then why was the need felt to have a different and a separate law?
Yeah. So there is a CBI which is basically a central agency which inquires into a lot of cases. For example, riots cases, even Arushi murder investigation is transferred to CBI. CBI also it looks into corruption cases,
Yes.
but it's an agency of the central government.
Okay.
Then there is the Central Vigilance Commission, which came in 2003, which is basically a vigilance and an inquiry body.
Right.
So Lokpal was a demand that there should be something which is completely independent, and its sole purpose would be to tackle corruption in the with the ministers, the senior most bureaucrats, the decision-making authorities.
Okay.
And that body will be in charge of giving the sanctions, making the inquiries, will be in charge of the investigations and prosecutions.
Okay.
So that demand was there for about 40 years.
Okay, so what you were saying is that Lokpal ideally should be an independent body. That's what the demand was, because CBI and CVC are seen to be functioning under the government control, under the government's executive.
Yeah, so
control.
independence in both ways, in the manner of appointment and in the manner of functioning.
Okay.
So that was needed. That it will have its in a way own cadre. The investigating officers will not be like reporting to the government of India, or will not be governed by the service rules. The disciplinary authority will also be the Lokpal.
Okay,
And
these
the
are
police,
those officers.
the police officers will also be reporting only to the Lokpal.
So let's come on the structure of Lokpal now. So what is the act, the law really envisage? What is the structure of Lokpal?
Yeah. So the Lokpal
And what is
Act-
the grievance redressal mechanism? In the sense, can anybody, any citizen approach the Lokpal with a complaint, or can the Lokpal take up suo motu cognizance cases? So what exactly does the law talk about, the framework of
So
the law?
Lokpal, as it now stands, as it was passed in 2013, is a body in which it is headed by a chairperson who is a retired Supreme Court judge or a retired Chief Justice of a High Court, and there are other members. The appointment authority is headed by a committee headed by a Prime Minister, in which the other members are the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, the Leader of Opposition, the Chief Justice, and an eminent jurist to be nominated by the chairperson, which is the Prime Minister. So really speaking, the government, because the Lok Sabha Speaker is also with the government, and the jurist is also appointed of its choice by the government. So the government has a major say in the appointment. The other voices are only the Leader of Opposition and the Chief Justice of India. So it's
Independent voices,
yeah,
you can
in
say.
3:2. But the other and the role of Lokpal is basically to inquire into corruption, Prevention of Corruption Act complaints against Prime Minister, except certain categories of cases like defense or international relations. All the ministers, the Group A and Group B public servants. So that is the main remit of Lokpal, only Corruption Act.
Okay, okay.
But the Act provides that they can do an inquiry, and they can order investigation by the CBI. They don't have an independent agency of their own.
So
for
there's no
investigation.
cadre per se for the Lokpal, but the Lokpal can authorize or ask the CBI to conduct an investigation.
conduct an
Only the CBI, or could it be anybody else?
No,
Could it
only-
be the state police, or could it be any other investigating agency, or is it only the CBI?
It's mainly the CBI, because they can't ask the state agency. For state agencies, there would be the Lokayukta in
Okay.
respective states.
Okay.
So states have to have their own laws. They can adopt the same Lokpal method at the center, or have their own Lokayukta
Act.
in their own acts.
So, Pranav, could you just tell us a little bit about the constitution of the Lokpal? In the sense, it's headed by, as you pointed out, it's headed by the a former retired Supreme Court judge of India. And then who all are the members of Lokpal?
So basically, this act came into force in 2014. The act was passed in 2013. In 2014, it was notified. Till 2019, there was no Lokpal. So for 5 years, we had a headless body. No rules were framed, and the government delayed it. There were litigation, but ultimately nothing came out of it. Then in 2019, ultimately the rules for appointments were framed, and the first appointment of Justice P.C. Ghosh, who was a retired Supreme Court judge, was made. And then he demitted his office in 2022, and then another retired Chief Justice of a High Court was appointed.
Okay.
The Act provides that it can have one chairperson and not more than 8 members.
Okay.
So right now there are about 4 or 5 members other than the chairperson.
Okay. And so the quorum, we can say, is not complete. Is that so?
No, quorum may be even the members.
Yeah.
One member retired complaining that there was a lack of work.
Oh, I
For
see.
which
Okay.
the reasons are obvious, with which we'll come to
We'll get
when
to
we
that,
get to
yeah.
the functioning.
That's
Yeah,
right.
but that's where we
Yeah.
should get to next, about what powers and functions does this authority have
Yeah.
on
so
ground also, on paper also, and on ground.
Yeah. So see, ultimately powers depend on the people. If you are willing to do your job, then you can actually cause trouble and take care of investigations and inquire into complaints of corruption. But if you are actually closing down complaints, so and then not ordering investigation even with the powers that you have, so then there is no use of such powers, because there is a report by the Parliamentary Standing Committee of March this year, which was tabled in Parliament in March this year, which said that it had received about 8,700
The Lokpal had
complaints,
received, okay.
and around 6,000 were disposed of. Majority of them were disposed of on the ground that they do not prescribe to the format.
Okay.
There is a format given on the website, and it's a very lengthy format.
Okay.
Because my wife, who's a lawyer, she was approached by a client to file a complaint against a minister. So she said maybe Lokpal would be the best avenue for that, and then they tried to file a complaint, but they could not fill up the form, even though they are my wife was a lawyer. So then she said it's better to directly complain to CBI or to CVC,
Okay.
because a person who mainly comes and says that these are my allegations, and so therefore please cause an investigation.
So there is a grievance redressal mechanism system, but what you're saying that the system which has been created is pretty tough, in the sense it is not a user-friendly mechanism,
Yes.
not a citizen-friendly
And not
mechanism.
accessible to the people, probably. This authority isn't accessible to the people.
So the people who are doing the work, they are closing down complaints.
Right.
They are not really causing investigations.
Okay.
The parliamentary committee said not even a single prosecution.
I'm
Okay.
sorry,
Has
so
been
they have
conducted.
independent investigating powers as well, or do they take
They
help
do
from
not
other?
have.
Okay.
They have they can do an inquiry in house. They can have their own inquiry teams, and if a criminal investigation is required, they can ask the CBI
Right.
to
Right.
do it. And till today, not even a single prosecution has been conducted by the Lokpal
Okay.
since Lokpal was appointed in 2019.
So
We
they
are
have
4
not
years
even
down
taken
the
the
line.
first step, that is of holding an internal inquiry into a
They
complaint.
might have inquired into a few complaints. They would have closed the complaints, or later on would have found that there is no merit.
But out of 8,000, not even one that went to prosecution.
Not even one prosecution has been conducted, because see, the corruption has not come down in this country after the Lokpal was appointed or the Lokpal Act was passed. The corruption, as the Anna Hazare used to say, that every government is more corrupt than the previous government. So the scale of corruption is high. But right now, now the situation is when the other agencies are completely under the control of the government. Now even the CAG, which was bringing out corruption cases in the past, is not doing so, or the CBI is not able to do any independent investigation against the government, or CVC also. And even the media or the judiciary are not willing to take on really tough cases of corruption wherever evidence, or to inquire into them,
At least to inquire into them.
at least to get an independent inquiry done into them. So at that stage, Lokpal would have become much more relevant and much more important. But Lokpal is also not doing its job. So therefore, we have a situation where zero prosecution is there in the country.
So, Pranav, this is, of course, Lokpal is at the central level. What about the states?
So states can have their own Lokpal or Lokayukta. Some states like Karnataka, Odisha, these states had their own Lokpals even much before, or Lokayuktas, much before the 2013 Act. And they had done good job, because, for example, Karnataka has its own Lokpal police.
Okay.
So the police was directly reporting, and the Lokpal was able to do inquiries and launch prosecutions.
Okay.
Especially like in mining cases when Justice Santosh Hegde was heading the Lokayukta of Karnataka.
Right. Right. So we've had in states we've had Lokayuktas pretty active.
Yes.
But what happened at the central level? If you mentioned dilutions earlier, there have been amendments as well. You mentioned that it took 4-5 years for an appointment to be made. What happened from 2013 up until now?
Yeah, so it's a completely sorry state of affairs because the Anna movement in a way failed, and the public interest also dwindled, and there was no demand now that the act has been passed to actually bring it into force, actually have a functioning Lokpal. The people also were moved on to other issues. So therefore, we had a situation where there was no Lokpal, and when there is a Lokpal, there is no functioning Lokpal. When all the it's a report of the Parliamentary Standing Committee tabled this year in March 2023. No, not even a single prosecution. And there is a report of 2 years back of ThePrint, where they say that 3 years have been made, and Lokpal is this is the heading of the Print headline: Lokpal is a non-starter. Complaints dry up, questions rise over intent. So there is no intent. So ultimately, institutions are manned by personnel. If the personnel are interested, they can do the job.
Right.
But if appointments are made of people who are not willing to take on corruption, then there will be a situation where one member said there is hardly any work. We don't have any work.
And he quit.
And he quit.
As I understand, seems like different sorts of issues about lack of momentum. The momentum that started with the Anna Hazare movement wasn't really carried on, lack of interest by the people as well, and issues with implementation of the law. Were there any amendments as well that were made in these years to the law?
Yeah, there was one amendment in 2016. The Lokpal Act provides that all public servants of their spouse and themselves and their dependents will declare the assets. And those assets should have been made public. They made an amendment in 2016 that the spouse, etc., who may be private citizens, they don't need to declare their assets. And the assets will not be put on it will be only supplied to the government.
Right.
Oh, so it will not be, earlier it was to be made public on a public platform or maybe on a
Yes, the
website.
amendment clearly provides that it will be a declaration to the government.
Okay, so it's like now shrouded in secrecy.
So we don't
or
have
there's
ready
opaque
access to the assets of the public servants. We don't have access to their spouse.
And that's not even necessary to be declared anymore.
It's not necessary to be declared, which obviously causes you can't fight corruption if the public servants can hide their illegitimate assets with their dependents, with their spouse.
So final question now, what next for this law? Is there a way to salvage the law? What happens next? It's been a decade since that movement.
Yeah, so I think people should file complaints with the Lokpal, and then they should file writ petitions in the constitutional courts, either in High Court or Supreme Court. If the Lokpal doesn't do its job, they can say that my complaint was not investigated. If the Lokpal comes and says that it was closed because it was not in the desired long format, or it was closed without merit, then the court can inquire into it. So as long as we have an independent judiciary, like we file cases against CBI not doing an investigation into the complaints, we can take Lokpal to court.
So basically, another people's movement can only salvage this law.
Movement and an active judiciary, which can take on Lokpal and prod it to do its job. Like what we call a writ of mandamus, that when an authority doesn't do its work, then people can go to court, and court will issue a writ of mandamus and direct the authority to do its work.
Right. With this, we've reached the end of this episode. In this episode, we discussed about the Lokpal. We spoke about how it rose out of a very on-ground people's movement. And as Pranav and Bhadra, both of them said, for it to be salvaged from being toothless or non-implementable, there needs to be another people's movement probably and an active judiciary for this to happen. So there might still be hope. Thank you so much for joining us, and do let us know your comments in the comment section. Follow us on social media. Thank you so much.